So we know that a lot of people are plagued by concerns about how much they're normal, or have fears about not fitting in different ways. How should a therapist approach those kind of concerns when a client comes to therapy with those issues on their mind?
Well, I mean, my view is that a therapist shouldn't be overly concerned about normality, because the thing is, they should be helping their clients to embrace their differences and cultivate them. So
Yes.
I don't think that any therapist should be a conscious or unconscious agent of normality, that they should preach normality. That would be a serious mistake,
Okay.
because it is about helping the client to grow as an individual. So I think from a mental health perspective, normality should not be any means overemphasized. I think in terms of mental health, there is the practical realities of life, which is that in this society, we have to function. That is the word that's often used, isn't it?
Yeah,
And
of
often
course.
when they're talking about clients, therapists, they will talk about their functioning, how much they can fit in to that social fabric and perform the daily tasks that's expected of them. So because there is that social reality, a therapist, I suppose, has to think about normality up to a point, because the client is going to feel very estranged, very down about themselves if they can't fit in that functioning sense. So that's one of the reasons why things like social anxiety and depression are so painful, because it does affect their functioning. I mean, I'm not entirely happy with that word, but that is the word that's often used. So from a mental health perspective, I think we have to be concerned about normality primarily in terms of our functioning, how much we can meet these social norms regarding, things like work and private life. To just throw them to the four winds wouldn't be being practical, and it wouldn't be ultimately helpful. On the other hand, we don't want them to become entirely our masters either. And so I think that there should also be a real emphasis on the client being seen as an individual, and the therapist trying to cultivate as much as they can with the client that difference, that individuality too. If that makes any sense.
Indeed, and it does. It sounds like a very tricky balance. Pathological social norms will produce misery, and so it's difficult. It must be. Well, I can imagine it must be very difficult as a therapist to navigate that one. You have to help that person, I guess, fit in enough, and feel that they're, and obviously deal with the issues that they're bringing. But yet at the same time, you don't want them to over adapt to something that isn't necessarily a very healthy situation, I guess.
I mean that these are very good points, and I think the thing is that if the therapist, and this is something that David Smale talked about a lot, a brilliant clinical psychologist that wrote books on this, that if the therapist is just simply a spokesperson for adaptation, without critique, then they're not really helping the person. And there is a danger if you just focused uncritically on functioning, that you just assume that the client is like a part of a machine that is broken down, but the rest of the machine is entirely wholesome and good. And so it's just fixing that part, and then everything's hunky-dory. And I don't think that's the case, because as you say, quite very often society is a major contributor, maybe the main one, in making people ill. So I think when we're dealing with normality, and particularly in terms of functioning, that if the therapist isn't just an agent of adaptation in an uncritical sense, that they recognise, unfortunately, like the client, that there is an element of capitulation. So this is a society that they do have to re-enter in some way and function to some extent. But the more you can make them aware of how that society has made them ill, and how they can maybe alter it to some extent to mitigate its harmful effects, then they can adapt in a healthier way. Also, if they have an awareness of in what ways the society had made them ill, then in a way they regain their innocence. And hopefully they could adapt in a more knowing way, and in a way that doesn't harm them as much. It isn't easy, of course, because society is so powerful, isn't it, as a force?
Well, yeah, I guess that's all that could be done there, really, isn't it? I mean, if people can become, and if, if it's particularly in therapy, if they're working with a therapist to help them see ways in which, these particular norms are, distressing them, and maybe get more of a critical focus on the norms, so that they can think for themselves in terms of what particular norms they actually agree with, and or have no choice but to conform to anyway, to some degree, and which can actually be, put on the shelf to some degree. So I suppose there's a kind of empowerment that comes from awareness of the existence of these things, of the social conditions and the other norms that are being, for rightly or wrongly, that they're having this, strong reaction to, and I guess with that awareness comes a greater autonomy and hopefully over time, a greater ability to sort of navigate them without being crushed by them,
yes,
in that
I think it there is a sort of destigmatizing effect there, because clients, just like anyone else, have a great tendency to think that the problem is simply within themselves. So what is wrong is in them, and the world at large is excused. That the world at large is normal and healthy, and the unhealthy just exists internally. And this is something that David Smale wrote quite a lot about, in that he felt that psychology and therapy as well actually unfortunately consolidated that view, or usually did anyway, that the problem just lay within, whereas he suggested, I think quite rightly, that the problem is between people and not simply within people.
I mean, that is quite a liberating point as well, I guess, for people who are struggling with the sense of their own imagined abnormality, that, there's no sense at all in which society or everybody else is completely normal and well and fine, and they're deficient. It's very much not that at all, actually, so there's a consolation there.
Yeah. I think, I mean, just to use a basic example about it, is that I think what he was suggesting is that it's okay if someone comes to a therapist and is complaining of anxiety, to use things like CBT, to help the client see things in a more realistic way. That serves a purpose. But we should also honour the harms that are in their environment. So say if that clients feel anxious, largely because, or mainly because, they're living in a 2-bedroom house and they've got 5 kids and they're overcrowded. To recognise that their environment is playing a big part in their distress. It's actually more to do with what's happening between themselves and the environment than simply what's going on in themselves. I think there can be a tendency in therapy sometimes to bracket that off and look at what is called the internal factors.
Yes,
too
absolutely.
much.